Do not watch this video if you have a flight coming up and if you're sensitive to these kinds of things. There are multiple heroes in this story, but this is surely the type of story that nightmares are made of, especially with what happens to this British Airways pilot. So watch this video later if you must, but be sure to watch it all the way until the end, because I'm sure there's going to be some things that you're not going to see coming. Also, of course, to find out what caused this accident to happen. I'm also going to be showing a picture of the crew from this flight at the end. But first, if you enjoy stories about heroes and what they did in real life to make them heroes, go ahead and hit all the buttons, make sure you're subscribed and you've got on your notifications so you don't miss any future uploads. And now for today's heroes. On June 10th, 1990 in Birmingham, England, a British Airways flight crew was meeting together for their upcoming flight that day, which was British Airways Flight 5390, an international flight that flies from Birmingham, England to Malaga, Spain. This was an experienced crew that had been working in this field for quite some time. They were very professional and they took pride in their work. And the members of this crew, they knew each other pretty well, as they had worked off and on with each other over the years, so they were very familiar with each other and they were on first-name bases. This included all of the members of this crew, except for the first officer or co-pilot named Alistair Atchison. Alistair just drove down from Manchester that morning to work as the first officer on this flight, and he was meeting the other crew members of this flight for the first time during this briefing. Alistair was an experienced pilot with 7,500 total hours of flying time, with 1,100 of those hours that were on the type of aircraft that they were flying this day, which was the BAC 111. So after the final briefing was done and all of the crew members knew what section of the plane that they were going to be working in, the first officer, Alistair Atchison, he does a walk around the outside of the aircraft looking for anything that may be visibly wrong with it. This is something that is done before the flights as part of the safety routine. He checks things like the landing gear, he checks the body of the plane to make sure there's no deformations or bulges, he checks the wings of the airplane, he checks the windows for anything that may be out of the ordinary like cracks or bubbles. The pilot of this flight was a man named Tim Lancaster. He had been a commercial pilot for 21 years and he had 11,050 hours of total flying time, with 1,075 hours being on this aircraft type, the BAC 111. And while the first officer was outside of the plane doing his walk around, the pilot, Tim, was in the cockpit looking over the logs of the maintenance that was done on this aircraft. He sees in these logs that there was some maintenance done just the day before this flight, where the windscreen of the cockpit of this plane was taken out and replaced with a new one. So nothing really to be concerned about, just some routine maintenance that happens from time to time. So the passengers board the plane, they all get to their seats, they're all sitting down, they get buckled in, and the crew goes over their safety routine. And many of the passengers that were on this flight, they were very familiar with this flight as they had taken it several times. They're told over the speakers of the airplane about the weather that's in Malaga, and it's blue skies, sunny, and just a beautiful day there. And then they're told to sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. They're cleared for takeoff, they're at the beginning of the runway, so the first officer, Alistair, gives the BAC 111 power, so they speed down the runway and they take off from Birmingham Airport. This flight has a total of 87 people on it, which consists of 81 passengers and 6 crew members. So after their takeoff, they start their initial climb in order to reach their cruising altitude, which for this flight was going to be 23,000 feet. And about 2 minutes into this flight, the pilots, they turn on the autopilot. Then Tim, the captain, he takes off his shoulder straps and he gets more comfortable in his seat. Then about 13 minutes in the flight, they're at an altitude of 17,300 feet. And one of the male flight attendants, he goes into the cockpit and he asks the 2 pilots what they would like to drink. The pilots, they order a beverage, and then this flight attendant turns around and he leaves the cockpit. Then with no warning at all, there's a sound of a loud explosion. And the windscreen on the left side, that's right in front of the pilot, Tim Lancaster, blows outward and disappears into the sky. And almost immediately there's this white fog, this white mist all throughout the plane. This white mist throughout the plane happened because of the explosive decompression that just occurred. Because all of the pressurized air that is built up in the cabin escapes as fast as it can through the hole that was just made in the cockpit. And some members of the crew thought, oh my gosh, it's a bomb. And the scariest part was when the windshield was blown away from the plane, all this pressurized air that was built up throughout the plane, escaping the plane, it created such a wind through the airplane that it pushed the pilot, Tim Lancaster, out of this window. And he was almost pushed completely out, but his legs got caught on the steering column. The steering controls of the airplane were now pushed forward because of Tim's legs and caused the plane to now go into a nosedive. The autopilot that was on was now disengaged because somebody pushed down on the steering control. And Tim was now mostly outside of the cockpit. His legs were caught on the steering column, but the rest of him was pinned up against the top of the roof because of 350-mile-an-hour winds pinning him on the top of the roof. The throttle was also jammed forward, causing the airplane to continue to increase speed in this nosedive to almost 400 miles an hour. And Alistair, the co-pilot, he's still in his seat luckily, and he's now trying to regain control over this airplane while the pilot is outside the airplane, pinned up to the roof. The flight attendant named Nigel Ogden, he was the one that was just in the cockpit getting the drink orders from the pilots. He hears this explosion and he whips around, and he now sees that the pilot got sucked out of the front of the airplane. And he sees that his legs are caught, just barely keeping him from getting completely sucked away. But all he can see of the pilot are his legs. He also sees that the door of the cockpit has been ripped off of its hinges, and the top of it is now resting on the controls as well. And so Nigel, he rushes into the cockpit, he puts one foot in the captain's footwell, and the other leg put down the side of the captain's chair. He reaches over the controls and he grabs onto Tim before he's completely sucked out of the plane. Tim's shirt had been ripped off of his body because of the wind, and he's laying on his back on the roof of this airplane, being hit now by 390 mile-an-hour winds that are bone-chilling cold, minus 17 degrees Celsius or about 1 degree Fahrenheit, and Nigel is now holding onto him for dear life while the co-pilot, Alistair, is trying to regain control of the aircraft. And the two guys that are still in the cockpit, Nigel and Alistair, they're also dealing with this nearly 400 mile-an-hour wind, as it's a tornado just swirling around in the cockpit. Alistair is now making mayday calls to air traffic control, and they do hear him, but when they reply, Alistair can't hear him because, well, you can imagine how loud 390 mile-an-hour winds would be. And keep in mind, the pilot's feet are pushing up against the controls, and the cockpit door is pushing up against the controls, so it's making it really difficult for Alistair to regain control. So they keep diving down through some of the busiest airways in the world. So a mid-air collision is a real concern here, and it doesn't take long for Nigel's grip to start to weaken around the captain. The cold wind is giving him frostbite, and he can feel his grip loosening. The lead flight attendant, named John Heward, he was in the cabin with the passengers. He looks towards the cockpit and he can clearly see that there is chaos going on in there. So he starts making his way down the aisle to try to help. So he grabs onto the seats and starts to head towards the cockpit. One difficult step at a time, fighting against the wind, using the seats to help pull him forward while this bone-chilling wind is hitting him head on. He can see Nigel laying over the captain's chair, holding on to Tim, the pilot, and when he gets to the cockpit, he can see the cockpit door that's fallen forward off its hinges. He can see that the bottom of the door is pushed up against the frame of the door, and the top of the door is pushing on the steering controls. So the door is really wedged in there, putting pressure on the steering column, which is why Alistair is having such a hard time regaining control over the airplane. So John, as he's coming to help, he starts to stomp on the door. He gives the door just 2 good stomps, and it breaks apart into several pieces. This was before September 11th, so it was before they had reinforced doors for the cockpit. So that's how he was luckily able to break the door, by stomping on it. And just inside the cockpit on the back wall, so behind the pilots, there's another seat that has a seatbelt. So John comes in and he puts his arm through this seatbelt to anchor himself to the airplane. And then with his other arm, he's helping Nigel grab onto Tim. And so they're now able to get Tim's legs unstuck from the throttle and from the steering column. So now Alistair is finally able to regain control of this airplane. But instead of pulling up on the controls and leveling off out of this nosedive, he makes a quick decision to stay in this nosedive for a couple of reasons. He wants to get lower than the other air traffic in the area so they don't have to worry about a mid-air collision. And he also wants to get lower because oxygen levels are much higher at lower altitudes. So this would make it much easier for everybody on the plane to breathe without any oxygen equipment and not have to worry about passing out. The last 2 crew members, Sue Prince and Simon Rogers, they're still back in the cabin with the passengers, and they're hoping for an emergency landing. So they're shouting out instructions to the passengers so they'll know what to do for an emergency landing. And so in this dive, they went from 17,300 feet down to 11,000 feet in just over 2 minutes. And here at 11,000 feet, this is where Alistair pulls up and levels the plane off going out of the nosedive, and he reduces their speed from 390 miles an hour down to 170 miles an hour. But the 300 plus mile an hour winds was helping Tim, the pilot, stay up on this roof and be pinned there. So now that Alistair lowered the speed to 170 miles an hour, it allows Tim's body to slide down to the side of the airplane, pushing his body up against another cockpit window. And now that the plane leveled off, Simon Rogers, who was in the back, he goes up into the cockpit. And he gets to see for the first time the horror that happened in the cockpit. And Nigel, who was the first to grab onto the pilot when he was sucked out of the airplane, he's getting so fatigued now from holding on so tight, because he just refused to let go of Tim until he was certain that Tim wasn't going to fly the rest of the way out of the window. And Nigel can see Tim's arms just flailing now that he's down by the window. They're just flopping in the wind. And he can see Tim's face now. Because of the wind, it's banging up against the side of the window. He has blood coming out of his nose and out of the side of his head. And the most chilling thing, he can see that Tim's eyes are wide open, but there's no blinking. And while seeing this, Nigel then says to John, "I think he's dead." And then Nigel says, "I can't hold on anymore. There's no more feeling left in my arms. I just can't hold on anymore." And so with the seat that was behind the pilot's seat, they have Simon sit in that seat and buckle himself in. Then Nigel and John were able to get Tim's legs out of the steering column, and they hooked his feet over the top of the captain's chair. And Simon then puts his hands on the top of Tim's ankles and puts downward pressure on them, keeping Tim's feet securely on the back of this chair. As difficult as it's been to hold on to this captain's lifeless body, the crew actually thought for a moment that maybe the best thing to do would be to just let him go. Because even after all this, they cannot pull him back inside. And the co-pilot, Alistair, he can see that these three men are just exhausted, but he orders them to keep holding on to him. Don't let him go. And Alistair, during one of his communications with air traffic control, he told them that they all believe that this pilot is dead. But now that Tim's body is around the side of the plane and not on top anymore, Alistair knows that at this angle, if they let him go, there's a good chance that his body could hit the front edge of the wing and damage it. Or even worse, he could hit the engine and get sucked up in there, and that would just completely kill the engine. And so the crew members, they keep holding on to Tim while the wind outside just keeps knocking Tim's body up against the side of the plane. And now, flying at a slower speed with a little bit less wind noise, Alistair is finally able to hear the replies that are coming from air traffic control. And air traffic control asks Alistair if he's able to make an emergency landing at Southampton Airport, which is the closest airport from their current location. But Alistair, he asks if he can actually take it to Gatwick Airport because he's been there many times, he's familiar with the airport, and he's actually never flown to Southampton Airport. He's not familiar with it at all. But even with this, the decision is made to make the emergency landing at Southampton Airport. And so, because Alistair has never flown into Southampton Airport, he's never had the chance to familiarize himself with the air charts, so he doesn't know any landmarks, he doesn't know where any of the tall buildings are, the tall towers. These are all the things that are documented on these air charts. They're kind of like a map from the air. So they give you visual landmarks and they tell you the height of buildings and the height of tall towers. So that way you can know where you are based on the landmarks, and you can also fly at a safe altitude. And unfortunately, all of the air charts that were on board that plane that were in the cockpit, they all blew out of the window the same time the pilot did. So Alistair agrees and he says to air traffic control, "Okay, I'll fly to Southampton, but please give me radar support and tell me where I need to fly." So they give him his bearings, they guide him towards Southampton Airport, and once he gets close enough, he switches his frequency over to the Southampton Airport air traffic control. Air traffic asks Alistair about the situation. Alistair informs him that they've lost all pressure, they need to make an emergency landing, they've had an explosive decompression, and also that they're currently flying with the pilot hanging halfway out the window and they believe he's dead. The air trafficker, hearing this information, he's absolutely stunned by this because these kinds of things, they just don't happen. But the air trafficker, he makes all the calls that he can to get all of the necessary emergency personnel at the location where they're going to be landing. But unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that because Alistair, he knows that they still have full fuel tanks. Most of the fuel has not been used because they needed to cut this flight very short. And this particular aircraft does not have a way to dump fuel. So the added weight of this fuel means that they're going to need a longer runway in order to make a full stop, because more weight means more momentum. So Alistair, he requests a runway that's at least 2,500 meters long. But air traffic replies and lets him know that the longest runway they have at that airport is 1,800 meters. Alistair knows that there's nothing he can really do, so he just accepts that information and continues to make his approach to land. But usually the pilot and the co-pilot, they're flying together, they're communicating while they're landing, especially in an emergency situation. But now, Alistair, he has to do everything on his own, so it becomes very stressful. And so during the final approach for landing, air traffic control goes silent once he's sure that Alistair has a visual of the runway, because it's very clear that both the air trafficker and Alistair, they know that Alistair needs to concentrate as much as he can. Nigel was now back in the cabin with Sue, and they're shouting to the passengers to brace for an emergency landing. And Alistair then, all on his own, he successfully lands the plane at Southampton Airport. He makes a full stop right there on the runway, and then everybody starts to evacuate with the emergency vehicles all around. And finally, after 20 agonizing minutes, they're finally able to pull in the lifeless body of the pilot, Tim Lancaster. The rescue workers, they get Tim's body, they put it on a gurney, and they get him out of the plane and on the ground. And then something miraculous happened that nobody expected. Captain Tim Lancaster starts to regain consciousness. It was a very shallow consciousness, but he remembers only the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles. He doesn't remember hearing anybody's voices, he doesn't remember any conversations. The only thing he remembers from being there and regaining consciousness at this location were the flashing lights. He doesn't remember anything else until waking up in the hospital in Southampton. But somehow, after being blown out of the plane and being stuck outside the plane for 22 minutes with 390-mile-an-hour freezing cold winds, he survived and would make a full recovery. His injuries included multiple fractures, frostbite, bruising, and shock. But Tim loved flying so much that even after all of that, after a 5-month-long recovery period, Tim continued being a pilot for British Airways. The cause of this horrific event goes back to maintenance, with the replacement of the windshield that just took place the day before this flight. So some jetliners, they have their windshields fitted from the outside of the plane and they're bolted from the outside, and some jetliners have their windshields fitted from the inside of the plane, where far less bolts are required to keep it into place and seal the window based on what's called the plug principle, where the pressurized air that's on the inside of the plane helps to secure the seal of the window because of the pressure that's pushing on it from the inside. The BAC 111 did not have this design, their windshield was fitted from the outside. So any weakness in the bolts could cause the pressure from the inside to push the window right out. So the engineer that did the reinstallation of the window was asked about it, thinking that maybe the bolts were the wrong size, but the engineer, he didn't believe that this was the case at all, and he still had the old bolts that he took out when he was replacing the windshield. And the windshield that he took out was on the plane for 4 years and didn't have any problems. But the engineer decided that while he's putting in a new windshield, he might as well replace the bolts as well. And unfortunately, there were several mistakes that were made, but the biggest one was that he did not check the parts catalog to see the exact size of the bolts that he needed for the windshield. But what he did was he took some old bolts with him to get some new bolts, and he just matched the size by eyeballing it. He told the store manager at the place that he was getting these new bolts that he needed them for the BAC 111, and the store manager knew exactly what size he actually needed. But the old bolts that the engineer brought in was actually even one size too small. So even though the store manager told him what size he needed, the engineer ignored him. He thought, well, these were in the plane for 4 years, they didn't have any problems, so they must be the right size. So he wanted to replace the bolts that he just took out with the exact same size. So, as I already said, the old bolts were actually the wrong size. They were one size too small, they were shorter than what they were actually supposed to be. But at least they were the correct diameter. So the threads they could grab on properly, and that's how at least it was safe for 4 years. But by the engineer trying to eyeball it and try to match new bolts with the old bolts, the engineer mistakenly got new bolts that were just 2/100ths of an inch too narrow. So this now means that the new bolts could slip out easier with the right amount of pressure pushing up on them. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened with the pressurized cabin. And so you've got all this air pressure pushing on the inside of the window, straining those bolts until they just slipped out. So if he would have just used the parts catalog as he should have, or even if he listened to the store manager who knew what size he needed, this accident never would have happened. But thanks to the entire crew on that flight, everyone on board, including the pilot, got to go home. From left to right, First Officer Alistair Atchison, John Heward, Captain Tim Lancaster, Nigel Ogden, Susan Prince, and Simon Rogers. Thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. I really do appreciate it. Remember to make sure you're subscribed and you've got on your notifications so you don't miss any future heroes. Thank you once again. See you next time.